Good morning, everyone. So today we are going to present on characterizing the spatiotemporal changes of wildland-urban interfaces across the United States. We are team one with Amanda, Carla, me, myself, Debayan, Denise, Jiwon, Parin, and our lead, Eric. So brief background before we go into our results. We all know that wildfires are not just, sensational headlines out there, but it does have substantial impact on the US communities. And identifying these hotspot areas goes a long way in increasing our disaster resiliency. So one of these areas we found was the wildland-urban interfaces. These are basically urban areas which are intermixed or in proximity to these wildland areas. And as we go through the decade, we have seen increase in urbanization and migration towards these wildland areas. So we are basically literally bringing the fuel to the fire. So this spatiotemporal analysis comes in face of that. And as our team was diverse and we had this a lot of work in demographic variables and disaster risk management. So we thought this was an interesting motivation or question for us of how socially vulnerable these communities that live within the we are in the whole of the United States, or contiguous United States rather, leaving Alaska and Hawaii. And our research objectives were twofold. One is tracking the spatiotemporal changes in the we area across the US for 2010 to 2020, specifically the years where land use land covers were available to us, and characterizing the wildfire risk and social vulnerability in the select we areas that we are going to present. So a brief introduction into how we mapped the we in the fine scale for the continental US. We basically took this from Carlson et al. 2022. We defined the building density as 1 building per 40 acres. And if that existed within a surrounding of wildland vegetation of above 50%, then we considered that as intermix we. And if it is in close proximity of 2.4 kilometer of large vegetation block, then we considered that as interface we. Now, 2.4 kilometer comes from a defined distance, how far the embers can fly and cause another wildfire. We did use the MRLC land use land cover dataset and the Microsoft buildings. And because we did it on a 30 meter by 30 meter resolution, it was very computationally intensive. So we utilized Google Earth Engine servers to do this on the fly and export our results. However, even with that, the interface we was still way more computationally extensive than we can cover within these 2 days. So we just focused on intermix we. So as you can see, by the naked eye, if you see 2011 to 2019, we don't see much changes, or we cannot figure out much changes. But if you aggregate it per state, you can see the eastern states are having lesser we cover than comparatively to from 2011 to 2019, or you can see the increase and decrease of the percentages. Now, we did try to show you for the whole United States how it's 2011 to 2019, where we's are expanding or where it's shrinking or disappearing. But trying to different colors with contrasting colors, it's still, we can see that intermixes have very little changes. Interfaces have a lot of changes, but intermixes have like spot changes, which is very hard to see. So we are going to focus on a few cities to see how it is changing. For example, 2011 to 2013, if you look at it, you'd see San Antonio has a lot of disappearing we's. However, go towards the Fredericksburg area, there is a lot more increase in the we's, given that there was increase in urbanization in 11 to 13. However, from 13 to 16 and 16 to 19, it seems that the people have become more conscious and there were more dense urbanization than spread out urbanization, which leads to a lot more green spots on that map. So moving on.
Yeah, so now that we've been able to map the WUI, we want to get a sense of how the WUIs translate to wildfire risk and then therefore disaster management. So while WUIs are susceptible to wildfire risk, there's not a guarantee that these areas will be facing high wildfire risk. And at the same time, we want to get a sense of how vulnerable the communities within the WUIs are to wildfire and what the coping capacity of these populations are. So in order to do this, we plotted both wildfire risk and social vulnerability spatially across the entire CONUS area to get a sense of the qualitative comparisons of the two values. So you can see here with this kind of blown up figure that it's pretty difficult to kind of ascertain what the relationships could be like at such a high spatial scale. So what we've done is we're starting to highlight some more of the local context to give a sense of how these two attributes compare over a more local context. So the first one we're looking at here is the Denver metropolitan area. On the right, you can see a map of the wildfire risk to building structures. And on the left, you can see the social vulnerability index. Both are mapped and clipped to the WUI areas for our areas of interest. So the right, you can kind of see a pretty clear pattern of wildfire risk. On the left, you can see high risk areas, particularly when it comes to mountainous regions. And as you get kind of closer to the urban cores, particularly in Denver, Fort Collins on the top and Aurora in the south, that wildfire risk starts to go down. But on the left, we can kind of see that the social vulnerability characteristics of these areas are pretty homogeneous and pretty low. So even if we see that there is high wildfire risk in this area, the coping capacity and the ability for these communities to be more resilient to wildfires is rather high. So this would probably lead to a different kind of perspectives and approaches to disaster management than other areas. As a contrast to Denver, here we're looking at a specific region in Northern California. This area has a similar topography to Denver. It's pretty mountainous. We see some pockets of urban areas scattered throughout. On the right, again, you can see high wildfire risk areas in these particularly mountainous regions. On contrast, though, this area is particularly high in terms of social vulnerability. So even if we do see a very similar physical wildfire risk in these two different areas, the response is going to be a lot different because probably in this case for Northern California, the damages are going to be a lot higher. And the ability to be more resilient and to bounce back from these disastrous wildfire events are going to take a lot longer. And then finally, to kind of highlight another case study. So this, we're kind of demonstrating an area that's not necessarily discussed commonly in wildfire literature. We're looking specifically here in the area between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. So here we can see that this area has a value of high wildfire risk as well as high social vulnerability. And this area is also home to a number of Native American reservations as well. So just here, we're just kind of really trying to demonstrate that more out on the west, we get more of an attention to wildfires, but there are lots of areas throughout the United States that also have high wildfire risk. And in order to kind of create a more inclusive emergency management response, it's important to kind of include particularly marginalized communities that may not necessarily be at the table for these kinds of discussions.
Okay, so in terms of the ethics for our project, we found that a lot of the ethical considerations we had to make were actually involved in the databases we were using rather than like the overall project itself. So we were able to pull out kind of three really prominent considerations from the Dion checklist. The first one was the collection bias. So all of our databases have their shortcomings. For instance, our social vulnerability index is based on census and American Community Survey data, which has issues with large margins of error, missing pieces of data, and things of that nature. Our NLCD has underestimation issues that are well documented with the tree canopy especially. And the Microsoft building footprint has issues with building counts, both overcounting in some areas and undercounting in others. The next one we pulled out was the missing perspectives. So like we said, due to time and computing issues, because this was a very big question at the beginning of the week, we did not map the WUI interface. So therefore, some of the towns that have been most affected by wildfires weren't actually included within our WUI. And that was just a limitation we had to realize. And then the last one was unintended use. So one of the big unintended uses we saw for this was insurance companies potentially pulling out the locations of these WUIs and raising prices in those areas for those customers. So that's just going to have to be a data issue we're going to have to face later on once we kind of think about where this project is going to go. So our final conclusions were that the WUI intermix areas have not changed greatly in the last decade, and that characterizing wildfire vulnerability within the WUI requires a more localized approach as opposed to that big picture. And then our next steps, we want to map the interface and expand the temporal record. And then finally, we want to determine the association between risk and vulnerability through a bottom-up analysis. Thank you.
We have time for one question.
45 seconds.
Okay, so you mentioned the variables that go into your definition of socioeconomic vulnerability or your vulnerability metric. Essentially, I'm curious if that's sort of like a composite metric, and then also how those variables actually correspond to like resilience or vulnerability, because I think we talk about those words a lot, but don't often clearly define them.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So I think in the interest of time, we were really looking at kind of using an index to represent a host of different demographic variables that are relevant for our study. So here, for example, we're using a social vulnerability index taken from NASA, I believe. Yeah. As it pertains to resiliency and coping capacity, that's a great question. And I think for the interest of our project, we were kind of more interested in doing a kind of initial approach to understanding what possible indications there could be in terms of a localized approach. But definitely when you were trying to explore more about what it means to be resilient in the context of wildfires in these communities, you definitely want to tease out those demographic variables, because you're right, they're not going to necessarily map completely across space as well as disaster types. So yeah.